So I am Justinian. I will be hosting a conversation with Raleigh Halverson and Garrett Holzer on the subject of Chaoskampf. And this word we'll explain in more detail in a minute, but for those who are completely unfamiliar with it, it is essentially a very ancient idea of bringing order to chaos through struggle. And there's lots of examples of this throughout the Bible and throughout a bunch of different mythologies and creation stories. So we're going to be exploring a number of those and seeing what Raleigh's research into Chaoskampf and Christianity can teach us about Christianity. Additionally, Raleigh has a ministry that he does, so I'm going to let him introduce himself and his ministry here real quick.
Hi, yeah, I have a ministry called Exegetical Research Group, and we do all sorts of study of the Bible and church history, biblical theology, and historical theology, for that matter. And we have a website called exrgm.com, soon to be a YouTube channel in production right now. It should be out sooner rather than later. But yeah, this is one of those topics that we have done a lot of research into and will continue to do research into into the future. So I'm excited to be here tonight to talk about it.
All right. Garrett, do you want to introduce yourself and have a chance to talk about any cool projects you're working on, if you have anything?
I am married. I'm a seminary student. I don't know. I teach a ton of Bible studies. I just came from 2 Bible studies, basically, back to back after work. So I love to study the Word and all things that pertains to. So randomly, Valen brought up Chaoskampf, and we just kind of went from there. I was just like, oh, I never heard anybody talk about this. You talk about this? And then, of course, Valen goes, what do you mean? I own like 1 trillion books on this. So, yeah. I don't know. I have no projects I'm currently working on besides ministry that I normally do.
All right. Yeah, this came up between Raleigh and I as well in an interesting way of just a conversation one day where I was talking about the few references I've noticed to the Chaoskampf, particularly in the Book of Job, and we'll get into that more specifically, but it seems to be an area of fascination for him and something that, I've noticed traces of but haven't delved into. So I'm eager to do that. So let's begin with what is this German word?
Yeah, so Chaoskampf, it's a German word. That's why it sounds kind of weird, because it's not English, it's actually German. And it became a popular word for the theological area of study, because in theology, there's a lot of German literature written. So oftentimes German words become popular and get picked up and used for theological topics, because German is a really cool language where you can smash things together to create new words very easily. So Chaoskampf is a combination of, the word chaos, which means what you think it means, and Kampf, which means battle or struggle. So it means the battle or struggle with chaos. And it refers to that exact movement in ancient Near Eastern culture and in biblical theology. Today, our focus will be on the sort of ancient Near Eastern culture side of it. And then in a future episode there's going to be a second part where we talk about the biblical theology of it. But it's important to establish that ancient Near Eastern background first. So what I want to do is I'm going to go through kind of a little introduction, but you're welcome to interrupt me and ask questions. This is a discussion. So even in the introduction bit, we're going to have discussion. Yeah, let's just jump right into it. I want to open with a more extended definition of it from a book called The Roots of Apocalypticism in Near Eastern Myth. Well, actually, that's more of an article by Richard J. Clifford, where he says, the combat myth was a customary ancient way of thinking about the world. Ancient Near Eastern philosophical thinking was normally done through narrative. To do philosophy, theology, and political theory, modern thinkers employ the genre of the discursive essay, rather than the narrative of the combat myth. Despite the differences, one should not forget that ancients and moderns share an interest in the ultimate causes, and both are intent on explaining the cosmos, the nature of evil, and the validity and the function of basic institutions in the world. So the combat myth, as it's also referred to, Chaoskampf, is a way for the ancient people to really understand the world and how it functions. This is a wide worldview, you might say. And a big part of this worldview is chaos in opposition to order. The idea is that in life and in the cosmos and in religion, which life and religion were very much fused at the hip in the ancient world, so to speak, order was the prime experience of human beings. We need to have order in order to do a lot of different things. Grow crops, have society be functioning. Order was really about things being functional. And chaos is about things being dysfunctional, things not having order. And so this is really the opposites of what we're talking about here today.
So I think a good example of the chaos and order in the world of antiquity would be, in the world of chaos, it's all literal wilderness. There's no civilization, there's no agriculture, there's no husbandry, but there's all this potential. And order is when you come up with a system to make use of all this potential in an organized fashion.
I love that you said that, because that is exactly what it is. And in fact, that's one of the symbols used in all of the literature, including the Bible, to talk about the order and chaos. The wilderness, the desert, is a place of non-function. It's a place where, there is no order. There is just chaos. It's an unordered thing. It's an unfunctional thing. The same thing with the waters. The ocean, the sea, is seen as a place of unorder and chaos. These are core terms to use to describe this idea.
Right. So, because of course, talking Chaoskampf, Leviathan's going to come up at some point, and we're going to be talking about the ancient Near East and Babylonia and the Enuma Elish. And so, one of the things we should probably explain first is what are the waters? They appear in Genesis 1, but what do we mean when we say the waters in this ancient mythos context?
Well, see, at the beginning of most creation myths, all that you have is primordial chaotic waters. You don't have the gods. You don't have the cosmos as we know it, with stars and a sky and sun and moon and all these things. What you have is just the waters, the chaotic waters. That's all that's there. And sometimes inside of them, you might have the Leviathan or the great sea dragon, the great sea serpent, inside of the chaotic waters, or personified itself as the chaotic waters. This is kind of hard for people to understand in the modern day. Oftentimes, the chaotic waters is the Leviathan. Like the waters themselves are, personified as that great creature in many of these myths, these creation myths. But that's what you have at the beginning. So it's fundamental to understand that in these beginning of these creation myths, what you find is just chaos, disorder. You need something to come along and make it ordered. And so, in many of these myths, that's exactly what takes place. But because in these myths you have the sea personified, or the great dragon or the great sea serpent in the sea, the Leviathan, you also need that creature to be defeated and battled with in order for any order to be established initially. So what I want to do is I want to read a quote from Playing with Leviathan, one of my favorite titles for a book ever, where they talk about the ancient Near Eastern cosmology, just to kind of create the picture in your mind, right? So they imagine the Earth to be a relatively flat disk on which a mountain or ziggurat temple tower rose up out of the chaotic waters. The disk rested on pillars, founded in the bottom of the primordial flood. The ocean also surrounded the Earth, which was therefore conceptualized as a huge island in a wide sea of water. This sea swarmed with creatures, small and big, worms, snails, snakes, fish, whales, and dragons. They were the creatures in the waters under the earth, Exodus 24, which the Israelites were not allowed to depict because they enjoyed divine status in the religions of Israel's neighbors, who gladly described, sculpted, and painted them. So we should understand here that the images the ancient used to talk about this theme essentially exemplified by things being unordered or enemies of order, right? So dragons, serpents, the sea monster, demons, these are enemies of order, or things that are on order, the water, the wilderness, and the desert. So that's, that's kind of a good introduction to what the thinking was of it.
I think from a disc, we can say that the world really seemed to be a dome. So you got, and think about this, without any education and without any real perspective or ability to climb towers and get in planes and whatnot, the world really does look like a disc. It's just a flat plane around you, and as far as you can tell, the world ends in any given direction when you run into water. If you walk on the surface, the world ends at the water. If you dig down, the world ends at water. And sometimes the dome in the sky leaks and water comes out. And so it makes sense of why you would think the world is built in this watery place and that it's just sheer chaos out there, because the closest we can get to this water is you either dig down, it's complete darkness, or you go out into the sea and it's complete chaos, especially in ancient times. The ocean is a monstrous place, and it makes sense that people would picture it as a monster.
Yeah, it takes sailors, right? Sailors would just go out there and not come back, right? Fishermen would go out there and not come back. There would be raging storms. I mean, think about it being an ancient person and seeing a hurricane, right? Just terrifying, right? All you can imagine is that is utterly chaos. That is not a place that human life can exist, right? Human life needs the stability of land. It needs the dry land to live and exist on. And so, yeah, you're right. That's exactly the idea. But what I'd like to do is talk about real quickly the four major aspects of ancient Near Eastern life that are affected by the worldview. Just to kind of get our bearings before we start going into the myths and talking about those. And again, feel free if you want to talk about any detail of this. We can go deeper, either of you. The first one is the agricultural. There's an interpretation with nearly universal acceptance among scholars. They hold that most of the combat myths reflect the transitions of the agricultural calendar, its narrative progression mirroring seasonal changes and their effects on fertility. In this sense, the divine warrior is principally the god of the storm and rainfall, and thus the bringer of fertility, sustenance, and life itself. Conversely, the enemy of the divine warrior represents sterility and death. The forces of destruction and chaos are embodied as monstrous creatures, such as a dragon or a serpentine beast. Every year, these cosmic forces, fertility and stability, the growing season and the barren summer, battle for supremacy. The lack of rain and relative dearth of summer signaled the temporary victory of the chaos monster, but the fall rejuvenation heralded the ultimate success of the storm god, whose autumnal rains then came to revive the land yet again. The agricultural interpretation provides perhaps the most basic and obvious sense of the combat myth, one whose universal significance would in itself justify the broad popularity of the narrative in the ancient world. The order of the seasons, so important to the agricultural societies, is explained, its origins made clear, the assurance given that even the harsh dearth of the barren season, life will spring again, such is the order of things, right? So that is the idea, that is one of the main ideas behind it, is the agricultural worlds, right? Remember, like, these people lived, like, especially like in Egypt and Mesopotamia, they lived on the agricultural calendar, right, so to speak.
Yeah, everything was about the food.
Everything was about the food, and especially think about Egypt, because we're going to talk about Egypt first when we get to the myths. Egypt relied on the Nile rising and falling for its sustenance, right? For its crops, for its food. It didn't get rain, but what it did get was the Nile's rising and falling. So most of their crops were built along the side of the Nile River, in order that when the Nile rose, it would water their crops, and then it fell and it would allow the crops to rest. And there were times when the Nile overtook and destroyed all of the crops. And this would be seen as the, chaos season where they lost most of their thing. They would stock up and be prepared for it. Or the season when the Nile didn't rise. It just dried up. And there was no rising Nile, and the crops died. This, too, was the season of chaos for them. So either thing can be bad. The wilderness, the barren wilderness desert, or the waters of chaos overtaking. So the second sense is cultic. linking the mythic narrative to the agricultural realities kind of allows us to appreciate the actual material context of the myths themselves, since most seem to have a cultic place in the culture, or what scholars call sitz im lebing, at a usually springtime New Year festival, at a celebration of new life and the return of fertility. It's not surprising that such a setting occasioned the myth's chief cultic realization, given the basic agricultural interpretation we just talked about. Yet the relationship of the combat myth to the new year is still more fundamental. Indeed, because the combat myth is essentially about order and the imposition of order onto chaos. The creative act lies at the heart of the myth. For this reason, the combat myth is often a cosmogony, the victory of the divine warrior resulting in the actual creation of the world. Since the creation provided the paradigmatic model for the New Year festival, the beginning as archetype of the new beginning, the role of the combat myth as the festival is further elucidated. However, to say that creation provided the archetype for the new year is not to suggest that the first was a kind of metaphor for the second, or that the new year was somehow modeled on creation. Rather, the new year was the creation. Each new year was a new creation. As Marisa Eldia has shown, ritual activity in ancient religious cult did not merely recall sacred deeds of the primordial past, it recreated them. Thus, ancient Near Eastern New Year festivals were celebrated as a return to the beginning of time itself. Indeed, each new year was a recreation of the cosmos. This eternal return helps to explain one of the chief concerns of the ancient New Year ceremonies: purification.
So each time somebody has brought order to chaos by creating a crop field, each year it is threatened, and until it is successful, there's not really any order to it.
Right.
And so you're recreating the universe every time order in the universe each time you start up one of these fields.
And the god is re-defeating Leviathan and re-establishing the ordered realm of creation. So it's happening in parallel. Like the New Year's festival was a recreation of the primordial event of creation. You would have a king who represents the god on the earth playing the role of the god and defeating the chaos serpent in the festival.
So I feel this is going to take us to Marduk.
This will eventually, right?
Okay.
That is a part of the Babylonian. We will talk about it when we get to Babylon in this discussion. But yeah, that's definitely a thing. Like the king is playing the role of the god in the New Year's festival, and this is happening in real life too. Fertility, life is coming back, right? From the dead, life from the dead, right? That's the idea. So it's a rebirth, it's a renewal, it's a recreation of the world, of the cosmos. It's a happy, happy time, right? So I like what Elodie writes, and this is coming from the book from Dempsey, The Combat Myth. She says, since the New Year is a reactualization of the cosmogony, the creation myth, it implies starting time over again as it's at its beginning. This is a restoration of the primordial time, the pure time that existed at the moment of creation. This is why the New Year is the occasion for purification, for expulsion of sins, of demons, of a scapegoat. For it is not a matter merely of a certain temporal interval coming to an end and the beginning of another, as a modern man, for example, would think. It is also a matter of abolishing the past year and the past time. Indeed, this is the meaning of ritual purifications. The semantic association with the New Year renewal, repurification, forgiveness of sins, and abolition is critical to our understanding. In this interaction of myth and ritual, the orderly cycle of nature's seasonal changes has its counterpart. In the human realm of religious rite, each one delicately informs the other. Myths about order are actively embodied as actions, which give a sense of order to human life. Patterned behavior and religious time imposes order on the bewildered chaos of personal experience. And as players in the cosmic drama, human beings themselves help facilitate the rejuvenation of the cosmos through ritual practice. So just hearing this, if you're Orthodox or Catholic, you should be thinking right off the bat, of
liturgical calendar.
Liturgical calendar, right? Exactly. That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about the sacramental worldview, right? Ultimately, in the ancient mind. In the ancient mind, the sacramental worldview, and in the mind we should have, I think, as Christians, the sacramental worldview is about us participating in the cosmic events. And that's exactly what this was about. This was about the participation in the cosmic events, the recreation. when we talk about Pesach or Passover, what we would call Easter in Western terms, what we're doing is we're not just, and this is really important, we're not just remembering and thinking back to the time when Jesus sat down with his apostles and ate the bread and the wine, but we are joining with them in that act. And that's exactly how the ancient people saw their New Year's festival. They weren't just like recreating what happened in the past. They were actively experiencing the creation of the cosmos, right, in their ritual acts, which is pretty wild to think about, right?
Yeah, well, I know the Orthodox and Catholics, the Mass and liturgy happens, across time. It is co-temporal with all other masses and liturgies, because it's all taking place on like this divine, we'll say, timeline, for lack of a better term. And so that reliving and re-participating in the event itself, each Pascha, like that makes clear sense to me. And it very like that's the spring season, the Lenten season, when we're
which was the New Year,
to the world, yeah.
Which was the New Year season when creation was reasserted. And what's funny is Passover in ancient Israel was this New Year's festival, right? You had the New Year festival, but you also had Passover, which both acted. There was this big complex of time where Israel was celebrating the New Year, and then from the New Year they were celebrating the new creation where God made Israel into a nation in the Exodus story. So this is the origins of what you're talking about, Justinian, with all of this, which is just insane to think about. Like we're talking about the origin of what the church has done for centuries right now. And so I hope you see like that this Chaoskampf topic is huge and all encompassing. Right. A lot of people think, oh, this is just a strange side thing that's kind of interesting and cool. No, this is an all-encompassing topic that deals with just how the ancients saw the whole world, right, and how they interacted with it.
Yeah,
so,
this is so ancient feasts and fast, of course, would coincide with certain aspects of the seasons, because people who had them off calendar, wouldn't have enough food at the right time. If you want to feast all winter, you're going to starve because you're not going to have enough food to get through winter. And so like our liturgical feasts and fasts have followed that same kind of pattern, and we're looking back on the foundations of these cycles all the way back when Chaoskampf was the only form of creation mythos, this logos story that we have from Genesis 1 and John. That's a relatively new thing in the understanding of the world, and these foundations are 10,000 plus years old. I mean, minimum 10,000 years. We're talking just in the written form, in the oral form, that could be 30,000 years old.
It goes back quite far, indeed. And that's because, remember what I said at the very beginning, the world, philosophy was explained through story. It wasn't explained through excursive essay like we do today, right? Excursive essay is basically like, I'm writing an essay about, this topic. No, it was explained through story. And through oral stories and traditions that go back to the ancient ancestors that are in the mind of the ancient world. So much so that when we actually go over these stories, you're going to see the similarity. I'm going to skip for now because we probably have about, 40 minutes left before we need to shut down this episode. But I'm going to skip for now the philosophical and theological perspective, and also probably a little bit of the political. Just know that the political was also seen as being reordered, and the way that they thought about philosophy and theology was filtered through this lens, right? It's important to know that. What I want to do now is I want to go ahead and jump into these myths. So I've included some pictures for everybody. And the first one is the Egyptian, this is figure 1-1. In the chat there, the figure is of Egyptian cosmology. And what's really interesting when you look at this picture is how the cosmology is the gods, right? Like the sky is a god, the ground is a god, and then you have what you see is you see a tomb or the sun disk rising in a boat on top of the sky, coming to stand at the center, and then going down into the underworld at night. This is the cycle of the day in Egypt. Let me read to you. So I'm going to read to you the actual creation myth. I want you to look at this picture when when I'm reading it, and I want you to like be thinking in terms of this picture as I'm reading you the creation myth. This is from ancient Near Eastern texts relating to the Old Testament. I'm going to refer to that throughout the rest of the episode as Agnet 3, the creation by a tomb. So hear this myth. I am a tomb. When I was alone and none, I am Re in the first appearances, when he began to rule that which he had made. Who is he? This Re, when he began to rule that which he had made, means that Re began to appear as a king, as one who was before the liftings of Shu had taken place, which he was on the hill, which is the Hierapolis. I am the great God who came into being by himself. Who is he? The great God who came into being by himself. Is water? He is none, the father of the gods. Another version. He is Re, he who created his names, the Lord of the Ened. Who is he? He is Re, he who created the names of the parts of his body. That is how the gods who follow him came into being. I am he among the gods who cannot be repulsed. Who is he? He is a tomb. Who is in his sun disk? Another version. He is Re, when he arises on the eastern horizon of heaven. I am yesterday, well I know tomorrow. Who is he? As for yesterday, that is Osiris. As for tomorrow, that is Re, on the day on which the enemies of the All-Lord are annihilated and his son Horus is made ruler. So you can see the concept is that Re arises out of the primordial abyss, right? The primordial deep. He creates himself, so to speak. This is the origin, this is the cosmology, the origin of the gods, right? Re self-creates, self-generates himself out of the chaotic waters, and then generates out of his own being the other gods. This is why what you see in this picture is the ground and the sky and all creation is the gods themselves. He brings into being these other gods out of his own being, who then become the ordered stuff of the cosmos, you might say, right? This is really weird for us to hear, because, like, what? They thought that the gods, like, came into being and then, like, self-generated out of each other. Yeah, that's exactly what they thought. And that the different elements of the cosmos were themselves gods, right? And that's why you see in the picture the god who is the sky and the god who is the ground. Then what you have is you have another myth, which is important because this goes to the combat myth, right? So starting with the primordial waters, and then you have what happens after that. So he generates all this stuff. Well, what happens after that? Well, in a ritual magic recreation of these events, we have a text that reads, Khepre was the morning sun god. Khepre is just another sort of way to refer to Ra, conceived of as a scarab beetle. In the following context, there is the play on the name Khepre and the word Khepr come into being. So that's why they use Khepre here. I am he who came into being as Khepre. When I had come into being itself came into being, and all beings came into being after I came into being. Many were the beings which came forth from my mouth. Before heaven came into being, before earth came into being, before the ground and created things had been created in this place, I put together some of them in none, as weary ones, before I could find a place in which I might stand. It seemed advantageous to me in my heart. I planned with my face, and I made in concept every form when I was alone, before I had spat out what was Shu, before I had sputtered out what was Tefnut, and before any other had come into being who could act with me. I planned in my own heart, and there came into being a multitude of forms of beings, the forms of children and the forms of their children. The text then goes on to give some extended details about the origin of the other gods, which I'm going to spare you the details of because it's kind of graphic, and I don't think it's kosher for this podcast, to be honest with you. But after it does that, it then states, when these gods, rich in magic, spoke, it was the very spirit of magic, for they were ordered to annihilate my enemies by the effective charms of their speech. And I sent out those who came into being from my body to overthrow that evil enemy. He is one fallen to the flame, Apophis, with a knife. So Apophis is the sea dragon, the sea creature in Egypt. Apophis with a knife on his head. He cannot see, and his name is no more in this land. I have commanded that a curse be cast upon him. I consumed his bones. I have annihilated his soul in the course of every day. I have cut his vertebrate of his neck, severed with a knife, which hacked up his flesh and pierced into his hide. I have taken away his heart from its place, his seat in his tomb. I have made him non-existent. His name is not. His children are not. He is not, and his family is not. He is not, and his false door is not. He is not, and his heirs are not. His egg shall not last, nor shall his seed knit together. And vice versa, his soul, his corpse, his state of glory, his shadow, and his magic are not. His bones are not, and his skin is not. He is fallen and overthrown. See thou, O Re, hear thou, O Way. Behold, I have driven away thine enemy. I have wiped him out with my feet. I have spat upon him. Re is triumphed over thee. And in a variant reading, over his fallen enemy, drive thou away, consume thou, burn up every enemy of Pharaoh, life, prosperity, health, whether dead or living. Then the great serpent, in the text, the great serpent of chaos had to be defeated as the representative of chaos, and creation was simply the ordering of the primordial deep to make the structured, ordered place for the gods and other beings to exist within. So you can see this is a ritual incantation text that, again, it recreates every year that same creation event. Do it again, they're saying. God, you did it once, Ray, we'll do it again for us.
I want to note, like, just for people to remember this story whenever we finally get around to Job, because there's a strong parallel in there.
Oh yeah, you're going to see a lot of parallels when we do the Bible in the next episode. So in Egypt, so what I want you to look at now is the next figure 1-2. And in Egypt, the primordial ocean surrounded the earth and was called Apophis. Every morning, the sun god Re and his helpers had to vanquish the marine reptile called Apophis. The great sea serpent encircling the cosmos had the form of a wreath. So its tail is perpetually fleeting, and from its own biting mouth. And you can see that in the Egyptian iconography there. The youthful sun god is still shut in by the primordial sea, which is depicted as a circular serpent chasing after its own tail. However, his foot is already on the beast, signifying his victory over it, right? The foot, you heard that when we read it, the foot being on the beast. And hey, I wonder where that comes into the Bible, huh?
I couldn't guess.
The second figure I want you guys to look at is Apophis with 3 heads. So he had 3 heads and some tails. Now this one is the 3-headed serpent encircling the lifeless body of the sun god. So here the sun god's dead, he's defeated, he's like in the underworld, and Apophis has victory. Now in Egypt, it was the god Seth who fought on behalf of the higher god Re, the sun disk. You can see this depicted in the next figure that I've shared in the channel. In Egypt, the battle was attached to the day-night cycle. Every night, Re, with Seth, defeats the great marine serpent. He stood in the prow of the bark in which the sun god Re traveled through the netherworld, and thus his spear into the mouth of the great serpent Apophis saves Re and his entourage from the terrible sea monster. Re would then go into the underworld and come back, rising from death in victory over the god of death and the underworld every morning. So remember, this is Re is the sun god. He's the sun. So the sun is rising. When the sun sets, this is when Seth and Re defeat the serpent every night. Because remember, where are they setting into? Visually, the chaotic waters, right?
Yeah, they seem to drop into the ocean and disappear.
Yes, exactly. And what's under the ocean? Well, the underworld, of course, in the cosmology of the ancients. So Re and Seth and his entourage in the boat go defeat the serpent, go into the underworld, defeat the god of death, and come back up and resurrect from the dead every morning. And this represents the victory over chaos and death. This is really important. Chaos and death tied together in the ancient way of thinking about it. Right? They are best friends, so to speak, right? The chaos serpent and the god of death. So you can see, and the image in the figure is the partially theomorphic Seth is thrusting his spear into the mouth of Apophis. This is found in the Cairo Museum. The Egyptian coffin text 160 contains spells against the great serpent Apophis, whom Seth had to conquer every night. Within the following coffin text, the battle with the dragon is located at Baku, the mountainous western support for heaven where the sun sets. So the mountains were seen as the support for heaven. Right? Elsewhere, the serpent is styled as Apophis, who threatens to devour the solar boat in the 7th and 12th hours of the night, and thereby destroy the created order, returning the world to its state of chaos, the pre-creation state, essentially. Various temple and even private rituals were derived to ensure the victory of Re and the continuing maintenance of world stability by the relation of a victorious mythic precedent of the divine plane. The coffin text spell was designated to accomplish a variety of positive goals for the living and the dead, including protection against the deadly serpents. So here's what the text reads. I know that the mountain of Baku upon which the sky leans of crystal, it is rods in its length, 120 rods in its width, 300 rods in its length, 120 rods in its width. On the east of this mountain is Soebek, lord of Baku, of Carmelian in his temple. On the east of the mountain is the serpent, 30 cubits in length, with 3 cubits on his forehead being of flint. I know the name of the serpent who is on the mountain. His name is He Overthrows. Now at the time of evening he turns his eye over to Re, and there occurs a halting among the solar crew, a great astonishment with the voyage, so that Seth bends himself against him. What he says as magic, let me stand against you, so that the voyage be set right. O you whom I have seen from afar, close your eyes, since I have bound you. I am the male. Cover your head, so that you may be well, and that I may be well. I am great of magic. I have used against you. What is it? It is effectiveness. O you who goes into his belly, you strength belongs to your mountain. But watch me as I go off with your strength in my hand. I am the one who lifts up strength. I have come just so that I might plunder the serpent-formed earth gods. As for Re, may he who is in his evening, i.e. Re, be satisfied with me when we have circled the sky, while you, the serpent, are in the fetters. It is what has been commanded against you in the divine presence. Thus does Re set in life. So remember, all of this is set in that agricultural, cultic, and political landscape. And these texts would be incanted every night and even once a year at the New Year's festival, right? So that's the Egyptian myth. You guys have any thoughts on the Egyptian myth? Crazy stuff. What do you think as we move through this here?
So let's see. I'm noticing a lot of parallels to other stories I've seen. I'm not as familiar with Egyptian mythology, so some of this is new. I recall the sky boat and descending into the underworld, but yes, all the daily struggles with Apophis is something new. I find it interesting how it always seems to take the form of a serpent.
Yes.
Well, not always, but very often seems to take the form of a serpent.
Curious, isn't it?
What's especially curious to me, given the waters, is that at least saltwater. I don't know of too many saltwater snakes. Maybe I'm just ignorant, but I don't know if that's a really common thing.
They liken this to a mythical dragon, a mythical serpent, a sea dragon, right? And what that might come from, I'll just give you a little hint. What that might come from is the ancient Near Eastern people saw the angelic servants of the gods as these great serpents, right? So what we're really talking about is a divine being here. We're not just simply talking about some great sea monster that's just a sea monster. We're talking about a divine being that seemingly is set against the gods in this case, right? But that's important to know, right? It's a mythical creature. It's not simply some creature that they actively saw when they looked into the ocean, right? Because remember, sometimes the ocean itself was characterized as the creature, which is kind of weird and freaky to understand, but yeah.
Okay. I mean, it certainly seems like the ocean is alive and has a mind of its own sometimes, so I can understand personifying it.
Yeah, certainly does. So the next one I want to move to, I'm going to move pretty quickly through this one, is the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish. Enuma Elish is the first words of the Babylonian creation epic. It means when on high. And this can be found in ANET 60. Okay, so the Babylonian creation epic reads like this. When on high, the heaven had not been named. Firm ground below had not been called by name. Not but primordial Apsu, that is the chaotic sea, their begetter. Mumu Tiamat, she who bore them all, their waters commingling as a single body. No reed hut had been matted, no marshland had appeared, when no gods whatsoever had been brought into being, on called by name, their destinies undetermined. So I'm going to pause here real quick. I want you to notice something. All of this is about what? Things having function.
Yeah.
Right? Creation is not about, in the ancient worldview, this is really important, it is not about things having, physical form. It's about things having function. So the gods aren't there. Why? Because they haven't been named. And a name, what does a name do? It assigns function to something. You name it, that assigns it function in the ordered system. So all we have is an unordered system with no function. And that unordered system with no function is seen as the great Apsu, which itself is Mumu Tiamat, the great sea serpent, which itself is seen here as the Apsu itself, the primordial waters before creation. This is really hard to imagine, right? Because when we think about creation, we think about like, oh, well, there was nothing and then there was something, right? But they thought, oh no, there was like unordered chaos and then there was ordered stuff. So it's kind of a different way to think about it. But I just want you to notice that as we read the myths. And it happened in the last one too, but it's more overt here, so I just wanted to point that out. So it goes on to say, then it was that the gods were formed within them. Lamu and Lahamu were brought forth. By name they were called, before they had grown in age and stature. Ashar and Kishar were formed, surpassing the others. They promulgated the days, added on the years. Anu was their heir, of his father's the rival. Yea, Asher's firstborn, Anu, was his equal. Anu begot in the image Nimmumund. It's a hard name to say, sorry folks. This Nimmumund was of his father, the master, of broad wisdom, understanding, mighty in strength, mightier by far than the grandfather Anashar. He had no rivals among the gods, his brothers. The divine brothers banded together. They disturbed Tiamat as they surged back and forth. Yea, they troubled the mood of Tiamat by their hillatry in the abode of heaven. Apsu could not lessen their clamor, and Tiamat was speechless at their ways. Their doings were loathsome unsavory were their ways, they were overbearing. Then Apsu, the begetter of the great gods, cried out, addressing Mumu, his vizier. O Mumu, my vizier, who rejoice my spirit. Come hither, and let us go to Tiamat. They went and sat down before Tiamat, exchanged counsel about the gods, their firstborn. Apsu, opening his mouth, said unto the resplendent Tiamat, their ways are very loathsome unto me. By day I find no relief, nor repose by night. I will destroy, I will wreck their ways, that quiet may be restored. Let us have rest. She was wroth and called out her husband. She cried out aggregated as she raged all alone, injecting woe into her mood. What should we destroy that which we have built? Their ways indeed are most troublesome, but let us attend kindly. Then answered Mumu, giving counsel to Apsu, ill-wishing and ungracious with Mumu's advice. Do not destroy my father, the monstrous ways. Thou shalt have relief by day and rest by night. When Apsu heard this, his face grew radiant, because of the evil he planned against the gods, his sons. As for Mumu, by the neck he embraced him. As for that one, sat down on his knees to kiss him. Now, whatever they plotted between them was repeated onto the gods, their firstborn. When the gods heard this, they were austere, then lapsed into silence and remained speechless. Surpassing in wisdom, accomplished, resourceful, Ea, the all-wise, Ea is like the supreme god, saw through their scheme. A master design against it he devised and set up, made artful his spell against it. Surpassing the holy, he recited it and made it subsist in the deep. As he poured sleep upon him, sound asleep he lay. When Apsu he had made prone, drenched with sleep, Mumu, the advisor, was powerless to stir. He loosened his band, tore off his tiara, removed his halo, and put it on himself. Having fettered Apsu, he slew him. Mumu he bound and left behind lock. Having this upon Apsu established his dwelling. He laid hold on Mumu, holding him by the nose rope. After Ea had vanquished and trodden down his foes, he secured his triumph over his enemies in his sacred chamber. In a profound peace he rested. His name is Apsu. For shrines he assigned it. So here what we have the gods coming into existence, right, out of the primordial abyss, and then we have the gods basically wanting to establish order, and the primordial beings of Apsu and the Tiamat not so happy about this, devise amongst themselves to do something about it. And then the chief deity, so to speak, comes along and says, that's not happening. And he defeats Tiamat, and he curtails the Apsu and establishes his temple upon it. This is the hillock rising out of the primordial waters, right? The hillock of the gods, the temple of the gods, the mountain of the gods rising up out. And establishing his sacred space on the back of the very thing that didn't desire for him to even continue his creative work, so to speak. It goes on then to speak of and his wife conceiving Marduk and Marduk's birth. Not going to read that to you, sorry. a little bit too spicy again for this episode. But then what happens is gives his power over to Marduk, right? And Marduk is seen as being given the authority and the power of to be the head of the divine council. But he must prove himself by leading the council of the gods. A bunch of stuff happens, and we have a lot of like conflict. Tiamat comes back somehow. It's not really explained, but Tiamat comes back and begins marshalling.
Somehow Palpatine returned. Yeah.
Somehow Palpatine returned. Tiamat begins marshalling her own forces and responds with deep contemplation. But Marduk then begins marshalling his own forces. All the Anunnaki gathered at that place. Their lips closed tight. They sat in silence. No god, they thought, can go to battle and face Tiamat and escape with his life. Tiamat was clearly seen as more powerful than the gods. So they were like, no, you fool, you're going to go to battle? You think you can defeat Tiamat? Who are you? You're just some dude, right? And he's like, no, I've been given the power of our common Lord, and I will defeat Tiamat. So he goes, and he strives in single combat. This is what it reads. He's locked in battle. The Lord speared out of his net to enfold her. The evil wind which followed behind, he let loose into her face. When Tiamat opened her mouth to consume him, he drove the evil wind that she closed not her lips. As the fierce winds charged her belly, her body was disdained and her mouth was wide open. He released the arrow. It tore her belly and cut through her insides, spilling the heart. Having thus subdued her, he extinguished her life. He cast down her carcass to stand upon it. And after he had slain Tiamat, the leader, her band was shattered, her troop broken up. And the gods, her helpers, who marched at her side, trembling with terror, turned their backs about in order to save and preserve their own lives. Tightly encircled, they could not escape. He made them captives, and he smashed their weapons, thrown into the net. They found themselves ensnared, placed in cells. They were filled with wailing, bearing his wrath. Then they were held in prison. And the 11 creatures, which she had charged with awe, the whole band of dragons that marched on her right, he cast into fetters. Their hands he bound. For all their resistance, he trampled them underfoot. Hey, there's that theme, trampling underfoot again. And Kingu, who had been made chief among them, he bound and accounted him to Uage. He took from him the tablet of destinies, not rightfully his, sealed them with a seal, and fastened them on his breast when he had vanquished and subdued his adversaries. Had the vainglorious foe had wholly established Anashar's triumph over the foe, Nimrandu's desire had achieved. Valiant Marduk strengthened his hold on the vanquished gods and turned back to Tiamat, whom he had bound. The Lord trod on the legs of Tiamat. With the unsparing mace, he crushed her skull. There's this crushing of the skull motif. When the arites of her blood he had severed, the north wind bore to place undisclosed. On seeing this, his fathers were joyful and jubilant. They brought gifts of homage, they to him. Then the Lord paused to view her dead body, that he might divide the monster and do artful work. He split her like a shellfish into 2 parts. Half of her was set up and called it as the sky, pulled down the bar and posted guards. He bade them to allow not her waters to escape. He crossed the heavens and surveyed the regions. He squared Apsu's quarter, the abode of Nindamu, as the Lord measured the dimensions of Apsu, the great abode. Its likeness he fixed as Eshera, the great abode. Eshera, which he made as the firmament. Anu and Lil and he made occupy their places. So Marduk has thus then become the king of the gods through defeating the great chaos serpent Tiamat. Yeah. And then after this...
This is like the birth of monarchy in general here. That's part of the interest of Marduk to me. So like coming back to a practical ancient person's level, we know that the Babylonian kings and the Assyrian kings, they would wear the insignia of Marduk, and that they had this kind of, we'll call it a New Year's ritual, where the king came down off his throne and was like scolded for how he wasn't a good Marduk this year, and like what he's doing wrong. When the king is doing something wrong, that the people bring him down off his throne, is he is not keeping order. He is allowing too much chaos. When you are a bad king and a bad Marduk, you're not keeping order.
Right, and he's the New Year's festival is the king reestablishing order and becoming the Marduk, becoming the good Marduk. Yes. So, but what happens here in the creation myth is what's really interesting is you see that like it's the defeat of Tiamat. Remember this. This is so crucial. He separates Tiamat into the skies and the seas, and then he separates the seas by the land, And then he starts, after this, what happens in the creation myth? What does he start doing? He starts ordering the cosmos. He constructed stations for the great gods, fixing their astral likeness as the images. He determined the year by designating the zones. See how it's all about functions, right? He set up the 3 constellations for each of the 12 months. After defeating the days of years of the heavenly figures, he founded the station of Nibiru to determine the heavenly bands, that none might transgress or fall short. It goes on and on and on. But what I want you to look at here is the next image that we have, figure 2-1. This is the struggle between Marduk and the serpentine sea monster Tiamat, with a popular motif among the artisans cutting seals. So this is actually a cylinder seal that is found in the British Museum that depicts Marduk's victory over Tiamat. So it's a pretty cool little image of it. You can see the artisans love to make these seals of Marduk defeating Tiamat. So like you said, it becomes a yearly cycle for the New Year festival with the king. And that's how it sort of plays in.
And even the coronation ceremony, they would take their crown directly from the statue of Marduk, as if it was Marduk granting his authority and order of the world to them.
Yes, yeah, exactly, indeed. And remember, we have this motif. We have Ea, who's like the chief god sitting behind, and we have Marduk, and Marduk is the one who's defeating the serpent. That's going to be important for when we get to the Bible, okay? So we have an old Anatolian myth, which is really what would be called Hittite, right? Which refers to the storm god defeating the sea dragon, Ilanaka. So this is a short one I'm just going to share real quick. The goddess Inara dressed herself up and called the serpent up from its hole, saying, "I'm preparing a feast. Come eat and drink." The serpent and his offspring came up. They ate and drank. They drank up every vessel, so that they became drunk. Now they did not want to go back down into their holes again. The human Hupisia came and tied up the serpent with a rope. The storm god came and killed the serpent, and the gods were with him. That's from the book Hittite Myths by Hafner. And I have a relief, figure 2-2, in the channel. The relief is of the storm god piercing the sea dragon with his spear. Flames and bubbles suggest the writhing monster causes the sea to boil. So that's it. You see a common motif is a spear being stabbed into the sea monster, right? So yeah, here, the last one. What's that?
I was just saying, right.
Yeah. The last one we have is the Ugaritic. This is the fun one, right? Because this one, much like Babylonian, is one of the closest cultures to ancient Israel. The Ugarites are Canaanites, right? They belong to the city of Ugarit. Ugarit was a city that we discovered around the 1920s and 1940s, in the region of modern day, Israel, modern day, what's the other word for Israel in the modern day? I forget right now, but
Palestine,
modern day Palestine, right? So Ugarit represents the Canaanite literature. This is really important because Ugaritic is the closest cognate language to biblical Hebrew. So this myth is especially important for our Old Testament stuff. So I'm going to read to you the myth, and the picture, the very next picture that I've shared in the channel, is the Ugaritic deity doing the thing. So as I read it to you, you're going to see that Yam is the sea in this. And by the way, Yam is the same word in biblical Hebrew for sea. That's pretty important. And then the word for the sea monster is actually very, very close to biblical Hebrew as well. And so the god in Ugarit is Baal underneath the chief god El, right? So here we go. This is the myth. And with Yam is the sheave of destruction. By Yam I shall be worm eater. And thanks to Nahar, devoted by maggots, there was a sword I shall destroy. I shall knock down his seas. Into the underworld will fall my strength, and into the dust my power. From his mouth his speech barely went forth. From his lips his word, and he gave forth his voice in groaning. Beneath the throne of the prince Yam, and Kotar and Harsis spoke. Indeed I say to you, O Prince Baal, I repeat, O charioteer of the clouds, now your foe Baal, now your foe you must smite. Now you must destroy your adversary. Take your everlasting kingdom, your eternal kingdom. Kotar fashioned 2 maces. He pronounced their names. Your name is Expeller. Expeller, expel Yam from his throne. Nahar from the siege of his dominion. You must leap from the hand of Baal like a falcon. From his fingers strike the shoulders of Prince Yam. The chest of the ruler of Nahar. The mace leapt from the hand of Baal like a falcon from his fingers. It struck the shoulders of Prince Yam, the chest of the ruler Nahar. But Yam was strong. He didn't flinch. His joints did not tremble. His visage was not discomposed. Kotar fashioned 2 maces, and he pronounced their names. Your name is All Driver. All driver, drive Yam away. Drive Yam from his throne, Nahar from the siege of his dominion. You must leap from the hand of Baal, like a falcon from his fingers. Strike the skull of Prince Yam, the brow of ruler Nahar. Let Yam collapse in a heap, and let him fall to the ground. Let the mace then the mace leapt from the hand of Baal like a falcon from his fingers. It struck the skull of Prince Yam, the brow of the ruler Nahar. Yam collapsed in a heap. He fell to the ground. His joints trembled, and his visage was discomposed. Baal gathered up and drank Yam to the dregs. He exterminated ruler Nahar by name. Atarte chided him. Dry him up, O valiant Baal. Dry him up, O charioteer of the clouds. For our captive is Prince Yam. Our captive is ruler Nahar. Then Baal went out. Valiant Baal dried him up, and Yam indeed dead. Yam is indeed dead. Baal will rule. Now, after this, what happens is, and this, if you know the Old Testament well, you might recognize this. What happens afterwards is Baal rides upon the clouds up to El and bows before El, and El gives him the eternal and everlasting kingdom and power and dominion. And with the everlasting power and kingdom and dominion, Baal then builds the tabernacle. He builds the temple space, which is the cosmos, which is the earth, right? In order for him to be worshipped within, for he is the ruling prince. He is the one who defeated the great sea monster. So he deserves the power and authority that El gives to him and shares with him. El's own power and authority. Now, stop me if this sounds familiar, Justinianus, at all. Do you recognize this at all?
It does, though I don't recognize it as a verbatim thing. Like, it sounds almost like a mangled retelling of a story somebody heard once a couple years ago, kind of thing.
Yes. So this, and we'll talk about this more when we get to the Bible in the next episode. But this is Daniel 7. This is the Son of Man riding upon the clouds to the Ancient of Days, who's given all power, dominion, authority, and rule by the Ancient of Days. The great sea monsters having been defeated. Right. All of this is all there. Right. It's all in that thing in Daniel 7. Just a little hint, just something to look at, something to think about for next time. But another text speaks of this in the Ugaritic text. So, by the way, I've linked these if you want to look at them. But it came out of the underworld with its talons. It turned the sea to foam. With its tongue, it licked the sky, and with its tail, it turned the sea to foam. She set the dragon up on high. She bound it in the heights of Lebanon. So that's another description of the great Yam, the great sea monster. It's a pretty descriptive example. It's clear from these myths that Baal's defeat of the sea god by which is the life-giving storm god Baal, was definitive. Was not the definitive once for all defeat of evil. As we actually have incantation texts from Ugarit which show us that this wasn't a once for all defeat of evil, right? And they read, "You should go into the land of Mahanamim in the region of Bashan. Solidify Yam, whose forked tongue licks the heaven. You should solidify Yam of the forked tail. You should put Tanun to the muzzle. You should bind him to the heights of Lebanon. Fall down, you will be ashamed, O Yam. Your roaring is shattered, O river. You surely will see the pit. You will be smeared with clay." There was seemingly within this text a hope for a definitive removal of the threatening sea, who is clearly identified here with the serpentine monster living in the watery abode. The Ugaritians were acquainted with the Bashan region and Haran. These are areas connected to the Canaanite cult of the dead. Now, what we think is that most scholars in antiquity have racked their brains about this particular chain of mountains. They found a solution in assuming that it was the solidified body of a giant sea monster, the Leviathan. Right? So the ancient people actually saw this chain of mountains in the Bashan region as the solidified dead body of Leviathan. The very fact here that the supplicant is praying for a repetition of the miraculous transformation of the sea/Leviathan proves that he did not believe that its petrification had removed the threat once and for all. The great Ugaritic Baal myth that formed the central piece of the religious tradition at Ugarit can hardly be called a joyful message of salvation to all mankind. On the contrary, this myth was never intended as a testimony of any final victory over the forces of evil. It was never understood as a closed chapter of primordial history. Surely Baal did defeat Yam, the sea, Leviathan, but he did not destroy Yam once and for all. And then we have the text, Baal dragged and put down Yam. He wanted to finish off Judge River Astarte rebuked the name. Be ashamed, O Baal Almighty. Be ashamed, O Rider of the Clouds. For His Highness Yam is our captive. Judge River is our captive. And when the word had left her mouth, Baal was ashamed for her. So it's actually his own consort, Astarte, who prevented Baal from finishing off his monstrous opponent. Later on, Ilu's wife, Astarte, seems to fear that Yam might escape again. In a still later episode, Baal himself refuses to let the divine artisan Kotar put a widow in his place, lest Yam might insult his daughter again. So Yam is still alive. As a matter of fact, Baal himself would not have been able to slay the sea god. When he is imprisoned with Yam, he himself confesses that all his strength had left him. It was only through an automatically striking weapon provided by Kotar that Baal was able to knock out his opponent. Victory over the sea and his monsters had been only a Pyrrhic one. Eventually, the god Ma'at, that is death, exploits this fact to his advantage in his famous speech at the beginning of Tablet 5. Although you defeated Lotan, the fleeting serpent, destroyed the coiling serpent, the tyrant with the 7 heads, you were uncovered. The heavens came loose, like the girdle of your cloak. Miraculously, Ma'at reminds Baal that the present status of Yam, he is a cupbearer of death. Death and the sea are allies, both beloved sons of Ilu, and they will attack Baal once again. Therefore, it's most remarkable that the myth ends with a prayer to Kotar to assist again in defeating Yam's monstrous Tanun and Aratish. The struggle between the god of life, Baal, and the formidable opponents representing chaos and death will never end. This continuing threat to ordered life explains Anat's explosive reaction to the mere arrival of the messengers of Baal at the beginning of the myth. She displays a disproportionate apprehension that Yam and his monsters might have mounted yet another attack on Baal, whereas she believed to have destroyed them all, including Tanin, Arish, and Lotan. Thus, not even the gods could be certain that Yam would not break loose again. As a consequence, man still had to fear the sea god, whose Steliites might come along any time to take away not only a daring sailor, but also unsuspecting others, even pregnant women. Even though Anat did destroy him as effectively as she could, after 7 years, Ma'at rose to challenge Baal again. In the ensuing struggle, the god of life and the god of death appear to be equally strong. To human beings, however, it sometimes looked as if Ma'at was the stronger. It should be noted that at the end of the myth, the god of death does not succumb to Baal. It is expressly stated that he gives in only because he fears the wrath of his father El. Neither in this case, nor in the earlier episode describing the victory over Yam, is it Baal himself who overpowers his opponent. Yam is defeated only with the help of the automatic magical acts of Kotar. Ma'at is forced to give up as a result of the intervention of the sun goddess. With such an unreliable champion, humanity had to fear that one time Baal might fall again, leaving the earth to the god of death for 7 or more consecutive years. The equilibrium between life and death attained in the Baal myth hardly can be called stable. People could derive very little reassurance from it. There was always a new Leviathan to be conquered. So that's really the bulk of the ancient Near Eastern myths that I want to share with you in today's episode with this.
I really like that closing. There's always another Leviathan. Like, there's always a new chaos on the horizon.
Yes.
We must always be ready to conquer it.
Exactly. And so these myths applied some reassurance, but not ultimate reassurance. And that's a key thing that I want to point out here is there is no eschatology. There is no end to the struggle in a lot of these myths. There is no and on the final day, Baal will come and strike the enemies once and for all and everything will be good, right? That's just not really there in a lot of these. It's just left for you to live with, for you to continue in your life, realizing the order of the world and the disorder therein, and struggle with it. Struggle with the chaos that might ensue, that could very well ensue for many, many years over the course of your life.
In many ways, that is the human condition, isn't it? Like, that's what we do while we're here, is we're here to tend to the garden, to bring chaos, order to the chaos that is an untended garden. Exactly.
And so what I'd like to do to end the episode here is very briefly talk here about Genesis 1 and 2, really just Genesis 1, 2, to kind of tie us in for next episode. And this is the part that I think both of you will probably like the most, because it ties us into the biblical narrative. So what have we seen so far? We've seen the chaos that precedes creation, having some kind of sea monster in it, needing to be conquered. The gods are formed out of the chaos, and then they conquer the sea monster. Well, in Genesis 1, we have something entirely different, right? What we have instead in Genesis 1 is, yes, we still have the chaotic mass, the tohu wabohu earth. Tohu wabohu is the Hebrew for formless and void, but that's a really bad translation of tohu wabohu. Why is that? Because when we look up tohu, we find that throughout the Bible, it's used of function, not form, right? Remember, creation is about function, is about assigning function, not about material substance, right? But about assigning function. So what was going on? You had the earth in a state of welter and waste is the best way to translate that, I think, based on the functional definitions of the words, right? Welter and waste. So the earth is welter and waste. This is a very disparate state for the earth to be in at the beginning of the story. But here's the difference. God doesn't form himself out of the tohu wabohu earth. Rather, God exists outside of it and comes to it and brings stability to the tohu wabohu. And you know what else we don't have in Genesis 1:1 and 2 is a great sea serpent that God has to battle. God just comes to the chaotic waters, the Tehom, the deep, which is a word that's really important, Tehom. He just comes to it, and then, it's calmed. The spirit flutters over the waters. The wind of God, actually. I think wind of God is a better translation for the culture of the time, because remember how we read about all the other creation myths where they sent the wind to defeat the great serpent, right? And so ruach, which can mean spirit or wind, I think here is best understood as the wind of God. Why? Because when it comes, it calms the waters. It flutters over the waters. The waters are calm. There's no tumultuousness. And God just then orders. He just then orders the cosmos, right? So we have the chaotic waters in the Hebrew. We don't have a sea monster. We don't have a battle. We don't have any of that. The Hebrew culture here is subverting the whole thing. They're saying, no, God didn't have to defeat Leviathan. In fact, Lotan, which is another word for the great sea serpent, the Hebrew parallel to it appears in Genesis chapter 1. But do you know where it appears? It doesn't appear in 1:1 and 1:2. It appears way down lower, where God creates the sea creatures. The word sea monster in Genesis 1, I think it's 21, is the first time we see the great chaos beast appear. But here, it's simply a creation of God. So you see how the entire thing is subverted. Right? Instead of this great sea monster pre-existing and the gods forming themselves out of it, out of the chaotic waters, God just exists apart from the chaotic waters. They're there in their unordered state, just like in the other ancient Eastern cultures. And God just comes and orders them without a battle, without a struggle, because God doesn't need to struggle. The God of Israel doesn't need to struggle with chaos in the way these other gods do. He just controls it. He just has power over it and speaks, and it does as he says. He assigns functions and order, and it is ordered. It has no choice but to curtail to him, right? This is so different.
The mythic gods need to bring order to chaos because that's what humans did. That's the human conception of this. This is how you make things into something. But they still, as you mentioned, the chaos existed. That it was a presupposed condition that there was a chaos monster, or there was chaos. And at some point, through natural theology or Greek philosophy, or even just kind of simple ontological reasoning, we end up with there has to be a state before even chaos. So if there was even going to be chaos, or if there was going to be order, there had to be a singular cause at one point. And that's what makes the God of Israel so different.
Yeah,
is that
because
he's monotheist in the truest sense.
For the ancient world, the single cause was the chaos, which is really weird, right? Like, the gods form themselves out of it, right? There is no cause outside of the chaos. But for the Israelite, our God is over the chaos. The chaos is there, yes, but our God is over it. He's in control of it. And we'll see more of that when we get into the Psalms in the next episode. But, Genesis 1:2 then presents itself as a polemic against the common mythological thought, writing in the terminology that would be understood by the audience of the battle against the waters, to show that they have no personal power. Thus, its nature is not derivative, but transformative of the mythic language, using the mythic language in such a way to preclude the ideas of theogony, theomancy, and the watery chaos having any independent power, thus establishing Yahweh as the God who has control over the pre-creation chaos. It can be assumed then that he has complete control over it, and it belongs to him, right? So for the Israelite, then it's assumed that this is something that God not only has control over, but it ultimately is his. It ultimately originates from him, right? And this is how we can then get Paul talking about creation ex nihilo later down the road, because the assumption is that, well, this chaotic watery mass didn't just come from nowhere, came from somewhere, came from God. And God takes and orders that chaotic watery mass into the cosmos in Genesis 1. That's what Genesis 1 is ultimately about. It's about order out of chaos. It's about creation ex chaos, we might say, right? Creation out of chaos, right? It's about the ordering of the chaos into the cosmos, into the ordered system of the cosmos. And the central element of that in Israelite thinking was mankind. Mankind was the center in Genesis 1. God was creating the ordered world for mankind. This is also different from the ancient Near Eastern myths. The gods are just sort of doing their own thing in the ancient Near Eastern myths for their own purposes. And humans are an afterthought. In many of these myths, the humans were made like later on to like be the slaves of the gods. Right? It was just like, oh, like, well, we've created the ordered system, we've created the ordered world. Now we kind of don't want to like have to deal with it. Right? We don't want to have to keep the order ourselves. So let's just like create these like, you know, meat sacks that do our bidding, so that we can just sit up here on the mountain and relax and do our thing as they you know, keep the order down there, so to speak.
And in most ancient mythologies, the humans were just the playthings of the gods, and that's something that Israelites did very different, as you mentioned, is that there's actually a purpose to us.
And the purpose of the cosmos, the purpose of the ordered cosmos, is that it is made for humankind, and that's the big difference. But we're going to get into more of that in the next episode when we get into the Bible. I just wanted to introduce where Chaoskampf starts in the biblical narrative. Now, we're going to find next episode that like Leviathan does appear in the Bible, and the great battle is something that's talked about, and we'll deal with why that's the case. But it's not talked about in Genesis 1, and that's really important.
Yeah,
because that's.
I mean, maybe we'll talk about this more in the other one, but basically the order that it seems that the books were finally written down. And, I mean, young Earth creationists hate this. One simple trick to make young Earth creationists hate you. It's very clear for a number of reasons that, like, Genesis 2 is much older than Genesis 1. That, in fact, Genesis 1 is actually probably one of the youngest parts of the Bible, or youngest parts of the Old Testament. And then we have, say, the book of Job, which clearly has some influences from hundreds of years before. So yeah, there's a lot to discuss with each book, and even chapters within each book about when these stories were finally put on paper, or a paper-like substance.
They arise out of the oral tradition, right? Job and the Psalms were oral things before they were written, and these were recited stories, and recited prayers, and recited songs to God. The Psalms were sung at the New Year festival, Israel's own New Year festival. They sung psalms like Psalm 74 and these other psalms which contain the Chaoskampf motif. And indeed, we as Christians, in the liturgy of the ancient church and in the liturgy of the modern Orthodox and Catholic churches, we find Chaoskampf all over it. In the recitation of the Psalms and biblical material, we see the Chaoskampf motif repeated for ourselves in everything that we do, in the Easter service, in the baptismal services, in all these things. So that can help tie it in, I think, for sort of how it drove forth into the modern day. The sad thing, I think, is that in a lot of evangelical Christianity, you don't have any of that, right? So the chaos motif just doesn't really appear for them. It
can't. When you have Genesis 1 literalism, like that's why there's so much confusion about what the heck is a behemoth, what are dinosaurs. Like if you apply the literalism to Genesis 1 through 2 and take it as a fact for fact historical record, you can't incorporate any of this Chaoskampf stuff.
Especially if you think of it as the literal creation out of nothing aspect, which most Christians do, right? When that's not what it's about. Even though we as Christians affirm and believe creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, that's not what Genesis 1 is about. And in realizing that is really important to catching this whole motif, the ordered system, and all that. So yeah. Did you have any thoughts, Grim?
Oh, so many.
I'm sure next episode we'll have more back and forth because it'll be more Bible stuff, right? But
Right.
Give some thoughts.
I mean, I'm always going to ask, and it's brought up a couple times, what came first, kind of the chicken or the egg thing? Like, is this just Israel subverting, or is this like, this is it? This is God plan A, kind of like the reason these mythos exist in other cultures is so that he can bring the world unto himself, kind of thing, through these mythos that started.
I would say that
all the same story, right? It's all the same story, and then Tower of Babel, kind of thing. And so
I would say number two.
Yeah. Right. Like it, and then the story gets bigger. I think if it's not just, because scholars will say, "Oh, yes, this is just this one thing. It's another story, right? The Bible's just another story." Or Israel is just subverting. Like it can be true that Israel does subvert, but it can also be true that God is over it all.
I think it's both.
Right. Not exclusive, definitely inclusive. And so I always think about that. And then the other thing, we didn't really talk about it in all of the other stories. Marduk is kind of like, when he brings order, he's good, but it doesn't seem in Scripture that God God doesn't only bring order. Sometimes God brings chaos.
Well, Marduk does too, right? Remember, Marduk is the god of the storm, and storms can bring fertility, but they can also bring chaos, right?
Yeah, it's cool. I think if God, when God gets to be kind of like above it all, the bringer of both, doesn't have to create from primordial soup, doesn't have to. There becomes this muchness, and so when a culture in evangelism or such gets to hear these stories, they could go, "Oh, well, my God just comes from primordial soup," or by things that we can't talk about on this specific
things that I skipped over.
Right. So it's like, well, that's different. Does this mean my God is subservient? It's like, look at Baal, subservient to El. Okay, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
So,
well, Marduk subservient to Ea, right? It's a common motif, and then this is where I think the biblical narrative knows the ancient Near Eastern material. Let me just put it that way. It is aware of the cultural mind of the ancient Near East in this way. These were common myths that were shared amongst all the people, and they were pretty much the same across the board. The Baal myth, the El myth, the Baal myth and the Marduk myth and the Egyptian mythos, they're all pretty much very, very like the same, right? There are differences, of course, but they're pretty much the same. And I would say that the Israeli literature knows of those things and speaks within that world. People oftentimes will question me when I say this, and they'll be like, "But I thought they were given visions." It's like, well, how do you think that God gives visions to people? Do you think he just like gives them a vision of something that they wouldn't understand at all? That wouldn't have any placement within the mind that they have already? No, if God gives someone a vision...
Maybe they just take LSD and then it happens. It becomes, or it's this weird view of even how Scripture is formulated. Is this like people just think that, I don't know, people pass out and wake up and then God wrote using their body or something weird,
Yeah, no, and God gives the vision and this is my point. God gives the vision in the cultural context. He condescends down to the level of the people he's speaking to, and then they see what they see in the mind of the culture of the day, so that God can speak to real people, right? So that when they hear this, when they see this, they're like, "Wait a minute, that's the Marduk myth, but like a better version of it, like an untainted version of it. Wait, that's the Baal myth, but like whoever this dude is, he's so much better than Baal, right? With the Daniel 7 stuff, right? And it's different too because." And you see a lot of the same motifs. The rider on the clouds. Baal is the rider on the clouds, as we read. The crushing of the head of the serpent. All these things reappear in the biblical narrative for a reason. The people of the day would understand exactly what was being communicated through that language, right? It's not to say that the biblical authors just sort of like were like, "Oh, here's some myth. Let me copy it and make it my own." No, it's, look, this language is known to all the people in the ancient world, and it's in the mind. Like the way I talk about it is the like everybody in the modern day knows Star Wars, right? Everybody knows Star Wars, even if you've never seen it. Luke, I am your father, right? Which in fact is actually wrong.
It's actually no, I am your father.
No, I am your father. There you go. But everybody knows it. See, here's the fun thing: no matter which version of it I say, you know what I'm talking about.
Of course.
Right? And so that is what these myths were like for the ancient people. No matter, like, if you use this language, people just knew what you're talking about, right? And so it's essential to use that language to speak to, and this is really cool because this shows us that the Old Testament isn't just something written to an Israelite audience. but it's something written to the whole world, right? It's something written so that anyone from the ancient Near East could read it and go, whoa, what?
This is my belief, good sir. But it's better.
Yeah, but it's better because their expectations are subverted as they read through it, right? And they're expecting something, and then something else happened, and so it keeps their grip, and they keep going with, okay, well, tell me more, right? This sounds better, right? And here's the thing: in the Israelite system, guess what we do have that we don't have in the other systems? We do have an eschatologicalization very early on, a very big fancy word that means a finalization of the chaos struggle that will finally happen at the end of time. That's something that happens very early on in the Israelite system that really doesn't happen early on in all these systems. The Marduk system didn't get it until thousands of years later. The Egyptian system took a couple thousand years to get an eschatology of any description. And the Ugaritic, from what we can tell, just doesn't have any eschatology, like at all, right? Now, we may discover some texts in the future where we go, oh, here's the eschatology text that we didn't have before. But, for now, it seems like from the discoveries we made, which are abundant from Ugarit, there really doesn't seem to be any eschatology going on with it. But in Israel, we do have that.
It's interesting that you mentioned the fact that these stories are written so that anybody in the Near East would be able to understand them and reach conclusions. And I find that interesting because, well, we were just talking about when Genesis 1 would have appeared, and almost certainly would have appeared during the time of the Babylonian captivity. And one of the other books that would have, well, we know it was written during that time, though Genesis 1 may have been a oral history much longer than it was written down, so we've got a few hundred years gap for that to develop. But we know one of the books that was written during the same time that Genesis 1 started taking off was the Book of Ruth, which is really the first story of a non-Jewish person being able to become and live as a good Jew. And part of that is because under the Babylonian captivity, this is the first time the Jewish people are no longer tied to a specific land and family, but they're a diaspora across an empire. And now they're not just a nation, but they're more of what we would recognize today as a religion that someone could actually convert to without being born into it.
Right, and that's really big because we today, when you read Daniel, right, and when you read the diaspora books of the Old Testament, let's say, what you find is God giving them, and this is some wisdom for people, really. God explains to them how they're supposed to live in this new world that they have created for themselves. Right, because the Jews did it to themselves, right? The diaspora is their fault. So God is saying, look, now that this has happened, this is how you live in this. And really, as Christians, this is what we live in. We live in Christians in a world that is and is not ours, right? A world that God owns and that ultimately Jesus' victory has brought dominion over, but that we have not found complete dominion yet. We are rebels in exile in the world, just like the Israelites were in the diaspora, right? And so these books provide immense wisdom for us as Christians, I think, as well, in that respect. And this chaos motif plays into that wisdom, I think.
Did we find a natural stopping point?
Yes, I think so.
Sounds like it. All right.
So if you
should leave us with lead us with Psalm 74.
Do you want me to read something?
Put us a bad taste in our mouth that we want to wash out with next episode or something,
All right. I guess we can read Psalm 74 if you want. O God, why do you cast us off forever? Why does your anger smoke against the sheep of your pasture? Remember your congregation, which you have purchased of old, which you have redeemed to be the tribe of your heritage. Remember Mount Zion, where you have dwelt. Direct your steps to the perpetual ruins. The enemy has destroyed everything in the sanctuary. Your foes have roared in the midst of the meeting place. They set up their own signs for signs. They were like those who swing axes in a forest of trees, and all its carved wood. They broke down the hatchets and hammers. They set your sanctuary on fire and profaned the dwelling place of your name, bringing it down to the ground. They said to themselves, we will utterly subdue them. They burned all the meeting places of God in the land. We do not see our signs. There is no longer any prophet. There is none among us who knows how long. How long, O God, is the foe to scoff? Is the enemy to revile your name forever? Why do you hold back your hand, your right hand? Take it, the fold of your garment, and destroy them. Yet God, my King, is from of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. You split open springs and brooks, and you dried up ever-flowing streams. Yours is the day, yours also the night. You have established the heavenly lights and the sun. You have fixed all the boundaries of the earth, and you have made summer and winter. Remember this, O Lord, how the enemy scoffs, and a foolish people reviles your name. Do not deliver the soul of your dove to the wild beasts. Do not forget the life of your poor forever. Have regard for the covenant, for the dark places of the land are full of habitations of violence. Let not the downtrodden turn back in shame. Let the poor and needy praise your name. Arise, O God, defend your cause. Remember how the foolish scoff at you all day. Do not forget the clamor of your foes, the uproar of those who rise against you, which goes up continually.
Well, thank you all for joining to listen. Thank you, both Garrett and Raleigh, for joining us. We'll figure out a good opening to do episode 2 and start talking about hidden Chaoskampf in the Bible.